The kingdom had already planned his funeral before the moon had chosen his fate. No one spoke those words aloud, but everyone in Blackthorn Castle carried them in silence. The halls that had once echoed with the confidence of the strongest Alpha King in generations now felt strangely hollow, filled only with careful footsteps and whispered conversations that stopped the moment someone looked up. Every servant lowered their eyes. Every noble measured their words. Every guard watched the sky a little longer each evening, counting the nights until the next full moon. King Adrian Blackwood still lived, yet the kingdom had already begun preparing for life without him. Tailors stitched mourning banners instead of festival flags. Royal advisors argued behind closed doors over succession laws rather than battle strategies. Merchants quietly raised prices, expecting uncertainty. Even neighboring packs had begun sending polite letters disguised as condolences before a single breath had left their king's body. According to every prophecy preserved for nearly 400 years, Adrian's bloodline carried an ancient curse that awakened only once every generation. Every previous king marked by the curse had fallen beneath the same full moon, no matter how many healers, scholars, witches, or holy guardians had stood beside him. None had changed the ending. The curse always collected its debt. Adrian knew the stories better than anyone. He had read them as a boy when his father still ruled, believing they belonged to distant history. He had reread them after inheriting the throne, convincing himself he had years before destiny found him. But destiny had never been late. It arrived exactly as the oldest scrolls promised. For weeks, a dark silver mark had slowly spread across his chest like frost beneath glass. It caused no wound anyone could see, yet each sunrise left him weaker than the last. Physicians measured his pulse. Herbalists brewed remedies worth fortunes. Priests offered blessings until their voices turned hoarse. Nothing slowed the silent countdown. Adrian stopped allowing visitors 3 days ago. He no longer wanted hopeful eyes searching his face for signs that did not exist. Better they remembered him standing tall than watching another sunrise from a chair he lacked the strength to leave. Outside the castle gates, another traveler arrived beneath grey autumn clouds. Evelyn Carter guided her tired mare through the crowded streets, drawing little attention beyond curious glances at the worn satchel resting against her side. Inside it were simple bandages, dried herbs, handwritten notes, and years of careful observations gathered from treating ordinary people everyone else overlooked. She owned no jeweled staff. She carried no royal seal. No famous teacher claimed her as a student. To most of Blackthorn, she was only another Omega healer whose quiet gift could ease pain but never alter fate. She had almost turned back after receiving the royal summons. Everyone knew what happened to the healers who entered Blackthorn Castle during the curse. They returned discouraged if they were fortunate, forgotten if they were not. Yet one sentence in the king's message refused to leave her thoughts. It had not asked her to break the curse. It had simply asked her to look. As Evelyn crossed beneath the towering castle gates, a cold breeze swept through the courtyard, carrying with it the distant sound of ravens taking flight. She paused for only a heartbeat before continuing forward, unaware that hidden somewhere within the forgotten history of the Blackwood bloodline rested a single truth no one had ever thought to question, and that overlooked truth would soon become the only thing standing between a doomed king and the destiny everyone had already accepted. Evelyn expected fear when the great oak doors opened before her, but what greeted her instead was resignation. The castle breathed like a place that had already surrendered, its towering corridors filled with polished armor, flickering lanterns, and faces that no longer searched for miracles. 2 royal guards escorted her through winding hallways until they reached the council chamber, where a dozen advisors stood around a massive table covered with maps that no one appeared interested in studying. Their attention shifted toward the quiet Omega carrying a weathered satchel. Instead of an expensive physician's case. One elderly councilman let out a tired sigh before speaking. "You are the last name on the list." His words were not cruel. They were simply exhausted. Evelyn nodded politely. "Then I suppose everyone else has already tried everything they believed would work." Several members exchanged uneasy glances, but no one answered. A woman dressed in deep blue robes finally stepped forward. She introduced herself as Lady Miriam, the royal archivist. Every healer has followed the same records for generations. Every ritual has been repeated exactly as written. Every remedy has failed exactly as expected. Evelyn listened carefully before asking the question no one else seemed interested in asking. Who wrote those records? Silence settled over the chamber. The advisors looked at one another, as though the thought had never crossed their minds. Lady Miriam blinked slowly. The earliest copies are nearly 400 years old. Copies? Evelyn repeated. Not the originals. Again, silence. Before anyone could respond, the heavy doors behind them opened. The room immediately straightened. Adrian Blackwood entered without ceremony, wearing a simple black coat instead of royal robes. Even weakened by the curse, he carried himself with quiet authority that filled the room more completely than any crown could have. His silver eyes rested on Evelyn for only a moment before shifting toward the council. Leave us. No one questioned the order. Within seconds, the chamber emptied until only the king and the Omega remained. Adrian walked to the nearest window overlooking the distant mountains, where thick clouds drifted across the afternoon sky. You are wondering why they summoned another healer after so many failures. Evelyn answered honestly. No, your majesty. I am wondering why every healer was asked to solve the curse instead of understanding it. Adrian turned toward her, and for the first time something besides exhaustion appeared in his expression. Curiosity. Most people arrive believing they already know the answer, he said quietly. You seem disappointed that you do not. Evelyn offered the smallest smile. Answers can become cages when no one remembers the questions. For a brief moment, the room grew perfectly still. Then Adrian removed one glove and revealed the strange silver pattern spreading slowly across the back of his hand. It shimmered faintly beneath the afternoon light, almost like frozen moonlight trapped beneath his skin. Evelyn stepped closer after receiving a silent nod. She expected the mark to feel cold. Instead, warmth radiated from it, steady and calm, completely unlike the stories describing unbearable darkness. She gently placed 2 fingers near the edge of the mark without pressing against it. The pattern brightened for less than a second before becoming still again. Adrian frowned. Every healer says the curse grows stronger whenever someone examines it. Evelyn slowly withdrew her hand. It did not become stronger. Then what happened? She looked directly into his eyes, carefully choosing every word. It listened. Adrian stared at her as though he had misheard. Outside, thunder rolled softly beyond the castle walls, and somewhere deep beneath the ancient stone floors, an old bell rang once without anyone touching it. Neither of them noticed Lady Miriam standing unseen in the hallway beyond the half-open door, her face drained of color as she whispered to herself, "That has never happened before." Evelyn barely slept that night. Long after the castle had fallen silent, she sat alone inside the royal library surrounded by towering shelves that smelled of old parchment and cedar. A single lantern cast a warm circle of light across dozens of handwritten journals, faded maps, and weathered scrolls that chronicled every king who had carried the mysterious mark. The deeper she searched, the stranger the pattern became. Every healer had described the curse as a force that consumed life, yet none had ever written about how it behaved. They recorded symptoms, remedies, and failures, but almost nothing about its nature. It was as though generations had been so desperate to defeat it that they had forgotten to observe it. Evelyn carefully compared each account, writing small notes in the margins of blank paper. One king reported unusual warmth before sunrise. Another mentioned hearing distant bells no one else noticed. A third described vivid dreams of standing beneath a full moon without fear. None of those details matched the terrifying legend the kingdom continued repeating. Then she found something even more unsettling. Every journal contained nearly identical wording, even though they had supposedly been written decades apart by different people. The descriptions were too perfect, too consistent, almost copied from a single forgotten source. Her fingers paused above one sentence that appeared again and again. The curse cannot be delayed. It cannot be reasoned with. It cannot be changed. Evelyn whispered the words aloud, then quietly shook her head. Those sounded less like observations and more like instructions. Before dawn, she requested permission to examine Adrian once more. He agreed without hesitation, meeting her inside a quiet chamber overlooking the eastern gardens where the first rays of sunlight painted the stone walls in pale gold. The king looked tired, yet calmer than the day before. Without speaking, Evelyn gently rested two fingertips near the silver mark on his hand exactly as she had before. Once again, the glowing pattern shimmered softly beneath her touch. This time, however, something unexpected happened. Adrian inhaled sharply and looked toward the window. The flock of white doves perched outside suddenly lifted into the morning air all at once, circling the castle in complete silence before disappearing into the brightening sky. The mark dimmed instead of spreading. Evelyn slowly stepped back. She watched his breathing remain steady. His pulse, which had weakened during every previous examination according to the royal physicians, remained perfectly calm. Adrian looked down at his own hand with quiet disbelief. "It retreats when you are here," he murmured. Evelyn frowned. "No. It is responding. There is a difference." She nodded. "Something that destroys does not stop to react. Something that reacts is aware." The king remained silent, studying the fading silver lines beneath his skin. At that very moment, Lady Miriam entered carrying another stack of forgotten records rescued from a sealed archive beneath the oldest tower. As she placed them on the table, a brittle parchment slipped free and drifted onto the floor. Adrian bent to retrieve it, but Evelyn reached it first. Across the center of the page, hidden beneath centuries of faded ink, was the impression of words someone had deliberately erased. Holding the parchment toward the morning light, she could just barely make out a single surviving sentence. It did not describe a curse at all. It described a covenant. Evelyn felt a chill travel through her chest. Every scholar, every healer, every king had spent centuries trying to break something they had never truly understood. Somewhere between history and fear, the truth itself had been rewritten, and for the first time in 400 years, someone had finally begun asking the right questions. The discovery spread through the castle faster than Evelyn expected, although not in the way she had hoped. By midday, whispers followed her through every corridor. Servants lowered their voices when she passed. Royal physicians frowned as though she had insulted decades of scholarship. Members of the council gathered behind closed doors, repeating the same uneasy question. What if the Omega was wrong? Evelyn stood before the long council table with the faded parchment carefully unfolded in her hands. Lady Miriam remained beside her, while Adrian listened from the far end of the chamber without interrupting. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the nearly invisible words hidden beneath centuries of erased ink. "This document does not describe a curse," Evelyn said calmly. "It describes a covenant." One councilman immediately shook his head. "Impossible." Another folded his arms. "Every royal archive calls it a curse." Evelyn looked around the room. Every archive after the originals disappeared. The chamber fell silent. She continued before anyone could object. Someone rewrote history. Every record copied the same language until no one remembered the truth. Lord Cedric Ashcombe, the king's senior advisor, stepped forward with measured confidence. His silver hair and polished uniform reflected decades of authority. "Young healer, you are asking this council to abandon 4 centuries of accepted knowledge because of faded ink on a damaged page." Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation. "No. I am asking you to explain why every record uses identical wording despite being written by different people across different generations." No answer came. Instead, Lord Cedric slowly closed the parchment and returned it to the table. "Hope can be dangerous," he said quietly. Especially this close to the full moon. Adrian finally spoke. She has already observed changes none of our healers documented. Cedric turned respectfully toward the king. Your Majesty, desperate people often see what they wish to see. Evelyn noticed something unusual. Every time Cedric dismissed her findings, he never looked at the parchment itself. His eyes remained fixed on Adrian, almost as though convincing the king mattered more than discovering the truth. Before she could consider the thought further, another messenger hurried into the chamber carrying an aged wooden chest covered with dust. Lady Miriam's request to inspect forgotten storage rooms had finally been approved. The chest contained journals, ceremonial records, and fragments of correspondence untouched for generations. Excitement briefly replaced the tension as everyone watched Miriam carefully lift the brittle contents onto the table. Evelyn immediately noticed several empty spaces where documents should have been. The catalogue numbers continued in perfect order, yet entire bundles were missing. "Where are these records?" she asked softly. Miriam's expression tightened. According to the inventory, they existed 2 years ago. Lord Cedric answered before anyone else could. Old papers decay. Time claims everything. Evelyn gently traced one empty compartment inside the chest. There was no dust beneath it. Whatever had been stored there had not disappeared centuries ago. It had been removed recently. Her heartbeat quickened. Someone inside the castle had access to the oldest archives. Someone had quietly taken only the documents connected to the covenant. As the council debated whether further research should continue, Evelyn slipped one small folded note from beneath the false bottom of the chest. It had escaped whoever emptied the compartment because it had become wedged inside the cracked wood. She unfolded it beneath the table where no one else could see. Only 6 carefully written words remained legible. They were not part of any prophecy. They were a warning. Do not let the king surrender willingly. Evelyn slowly looked toward Adrian across the chamber. Until that moment, she had believed the greatest threat was an ancient curse. Now she realized someone had spent years making certain the king would never learn the truth before the next full moon. Evelyn did not show the hidden note to anyone that evening. Instead, she folded it carefully and tucked it inside the worn leather journal she carried everywhere, knowing that if someone inside the castle had gone to such lengths to erase the truth, revealing her discovery too soon would only place the remaining clues in greater danger. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the towering pines surrounding Blackthorn Castle, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rain. Only 2 nights remained before the full moon. Every clock inside the castle seemed louder now, each passing hour reminding the kingdom that time was slipping away. Adrian found Evelyn standing alone beneath the covered stone walkway overlooking the royal gardens. The flowers below had already begun closing for the evening, their pale petals folding inward as daylight faded. "You have been avoiding the council," he observed quietly. Evelyn offered a small smile. "I have been avoiding conclusions." Adrian rested his hands along the cold stone railing. "You no longer believe this is simply a curse." "No," she answered. "And I no longer believe it has been acting alone." He studied her expression. "What are you not telling me?" Evelyn hesitated before removing the folded note from her journal. She handed it to him without a word. Adrian read the faded sentence once, then again, his face becoming unusually still. "Do not let the king surrender willingly." He looked toward her. Surrender to what? That is exactly the question no one has asked. Before Adrian could respond, Lady Miriam hurried toward them carrying another stack of recovered documents wrapped in linen cloth. Her breathing was uneven from climbing the castle stairs. "I found something beneath the old observatory," she said. It was hidden inside a sealed compartment behind the original foundation stones. Together they carefully unfolded the fragile pages on a nearby stone bench. Unlike every royal record Evelyn had read before, these pages had not been rewritten. The handwriting was older, uneven, and far more personal. It belonged not to scholars, but to the queen who had ruled beside the first Blackwood king marked by the mysterious covenant. Evelyn read each line slowly. The queen never described darkness consuming her husband. Instead, she repeatedly wrote that the moon waited for his choice. One sentence caused Evelyn to stop breathing for a moment. The covenant cannot claim a ruler whose heart remains freely given. Adrian read the line over her shoulder. That makes no sense. Not yet, Evelyn whispered. She continued reading until another passage caught her attention. It described trusted advisors urging the king to accept the inevitable, insisting resistance only prolonged suffering. Yet the queen warned that hopelessness itself strengthened the covenant more than fear ever could. Evelyn slowly looked up. Someone has spent centuries teaching every Blackwood king exactly what the covenant needed them to believe. Adrian remained silent as realization slowly settled across his face. Every prophecy, every ceremony, every carefully repeated tradition had encouraged the same response. Acceptance. Not resistance. Not understanding. Acceptance. Just then, a distant church bell echoed across the valley. Lady Miriam instinctively looked toward the highest tower. That bell only rings when the moon reaches its final waxing phase, she said softly. Tomorrow night begins the last day. At that exact moment, a castle servant approached carrying a sealed invitation bearing the royal crest. Lord Cedric requested Adrian's presence for a private ceremony of preparation before the full moon, explaining that every Blackwood king had participated in the same sacred tradition since the beginning of the dynasty. Evelyn felt her heart sink. She no longer believed those traditions existed to save the king. She was beginning to fear they had been carefully preserved to ensure the covenant was completed exactly as intended. The following morning arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel. Heavy clouds drifted slowly across the mountains surrounding Blackthorn Castle, hiding the sun for long stretches before allowing thin ribbons of light to slip through again. The full moon would rise before another dawn. Every corridor inside the castle carried the same quiet urgency. Servants moved carefully. Guards spoke in whispers. Even the ancient clock seemed to tick more loudly, reminding everyone that the final hours had begun. Adrian accepted Lord Cedric's invitation without protest. The ceremony, according to every royal tradition, would prepare the king to meet his destiny with dignity. Those words echoed through the castle often enough that few people questioned them anymore. Evelyn, however, could not forget the Queen's journal or the hidden warning she had found beneath the archive chest. She followed at a respectful distance as Adrian entered the oldest sanctuary beneath the castle, a circular chamber carved directly into the mountain centuries before the kingdom itself had been founded. Stone pillars surrounded a polished floor etched with silver lines that reflected the faint light of hanging lanterns. Portraits of former Blackwood rulers overlooked the room with calm expressions that now seemed strangely sorrowful. Lord Cedric welcomed Adrian with practiced warmth. "Every king before you has stood exactly where you stand today," he said. "They accepted the burden so their people would never have to." Several members of the royal council bowed their heads in agreement. Evelyn remained near the entrance, quietly observing every word, every gesture, every detail that others accepted without question. As the ceremony continued, Cedric presented Adrian with an ancient ceremonial crown and invited him to kneel before the central stone. "The covenant cannot be resisted," he said gently. "Peace comes only when the king embraces what has already been written." Those words struck Evelyn with unexpected force. They were almost identical to the repeated phrases she had found copied throughout the rewritten records. They were not prayers. They were instructions. Before Adrian could lower himself, Evelyn stepped forward. Her voice remained calm, but it carried clearly through the silent chamber. "Your Majesty, may I ask one question before this ceremony continues?" Every eye turned toward her. Cedric's expression tightened for the briefest moment before he forced another polite smile. Adrian nodded. "Ask it." Evelyn looked directly at the king. "Has anyone ever explained why the covenant requires acceptance instead of courage?" Silence settled across the sanctuary. Cedric answered before Adrian could speak. Because surrender brings peace. Evelyn slowly shook her head. Then why does every original record describe hope, while every rewritten record teaches surrender? The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Lady Miriam quietly unfolded the recovered journal and held it open to the Queen's own handwriting. Adrian read the familiar sentence again. The Covenant cannot claim a ruler whose heart remains freely given. His breathing slowed as understanding gradually replaced resignation. For the first time since receiving the ancient mark, he questioned the story he had inherited his entire life. Cedric took one measured step forward. Your Majesty, centuries of tradition should not be abandoned because of uncertain interpretations. Evelyn met his eyes without fear. Truth does not become false because it was forgotten. At that exact moment, the silver mark beneath Adrian's sleeve suddenly glowed brighter than ever before. Instead of spreading, however, the light pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat answering unseen words. A low chime echoed through the sanctuary although no bell had been struck. Every lantern flickered at once. Adrian looked from the glowing mark to Evelyn with quiet astonishment. It is reacting again, he whispered. Evelyn nodded slowly. Yes. She could feel it now with complete certainty. The Covenant was no longer waiting for the moon alone. It was waiting for the choice Adrian had not yet made. And somewhere within the castle, someone was becoming increasingly desperate to make that choice for him before nightfall. Twilight settled over Blackthorn Castle as though the entire kingdom had paused to hold its breath. Beyond the towering windows, the first pale glow of the rising full moon began climbing above the distant mountains, bathing the ancient stone walls in silver light. Inside the royal observatory, Evelyn, Adrian, and Lady Miriam spread every recovered journal across a circular oak table, arranging them in the order they had originally been written rather than the order preserved in the royal archives. For the first time, the true story unfolded without interruption. It was never a tale of an unstoppable curse. It was the story of a promise made generations ago by the first Blackwood king after a devastating war nearly tore the northern packs apart. According to the oldest records, the moon had offered the royal bloodline extraordinary strength only as long as each ruler continued leading by choice rather than fear. The Covenant renewed itself every generation beneath a full moon, not to punish the king, but to ask the same question again. Would he continue carrying the burden freely, or would he surrender his heart to hopelessness? Evelyn slowly lowered the final page onto the table. The Covenant was meant to protect the kingdom, she whispered. Someone turned it into a prison. Adrian remained silent for several moments, staring at the elegant handwriting of the first queen. Then every king after him believed he had already been condemned before the moon even rose. Lady Miriam nodded sadly. Because someone rewrote the meaning of every ceremony. A sudden knock echoed through the observatory door. A young royal messenger hurried inside carrying another sealed invitation from Lord Cedric. The council had gathered on the highest terrace to witness the traditional vigil of acceptance, the final rite before moonrise. Adrian looked toward the folded parchment but did not reach for it. Instead, he turned back to Evelyn. If we are right, then attending that ceremony would mean repeating the same mistake every king has made for centuries. Evelyn met his eyes. Only if you believe the words they ask you to speak. Adrian slowly walked toward the observatory window. Below, hundreds of lanterns glowed throughout the castle grounds as families quietly gathered, believing they were spending their final evening under his reign. The weight of their hopes rested upon him more heavily than any crown ever had. My entire life, he said softly, I believed courage meant accepting an ending I could not change. Evelyn stepped beside him. Perhaps courage is asking whether the ending was ever true. Her words lingered between them as the first bright edge of the full moon appeared completely above the horizon. At that exact instant, the silver mark across Adrian's hand shimmered once more. Yet instead of spreading farther, the glowing lines slowly separated into smaller patterns that resembled ancient symbols rather than cracks. Lady Miriam gasped. She hurried toward one of the oldest journals and flipped through several fragile pages before stopping at a faded illustration almost identical to the mark now visible on Adrian's skin. Beneath it, a single sentence had survived untouched by history. The covenant reveals its true form only when the rightful ruler chooses hope over surrender. Adrian looked down at the glowing symbols with quiet amazement. They had never been signs of approaching death. They had been words waiting to be understood. Before anyone could speak again, the great bell atop the western tower rang 3 solemn times. The vigil of acceptance had begun, and somewhere beyond the observatory walls, Lord Cedric was already waiting for a king who no longer intended to follow the path written for him. The climb to the western terrace felt longer than anyone remembered. Moonlight poured across the ancient stone steps like flowing silver, illuminating every banner that fluttered above Blackthorn Castle. Hundreds of wolves from every corner of the kingdom had gathered below, their faces lifted toward the highest platform where generations of kings had stood before accepting what they believed was their final destiny. Lord Cedric waited beside the ceremonial altar, his expression calm and reassuring, as though everything unfolding before them had already been decided long ago. When Adrian stepped onto the terrace, a respectful silence settled across the crowd. He wore neither ceremonial armor nor mourning robes. Instead, he appeared exactly as he had welcomed his people throughout his reign, wearing the simple black coat that reminded everyone he considered himself their servant before their ruler. Evelyn and Lady Miriam remained only a few steps behind him. Neither spoke. They understood that the next decision belonged to Adrian alone. Cedric raised the ancient ceremonial crown and smiled gently. "Your Majesty, as every Blackwood ruler has done before you, speak the words of acceptance, and the covenant shall be fulfilled." Adrian looked at the crown but made no effort to take it. Instead, he slowly turned toward the thousands of people gathered beneath the terrace. Families stood shoulder to shoulder with soldiers. Children rested beside their parents. Elderly wolves leaned upon polished walking sticks. Every face carried the same mixture of fear and hope. For years, Adrian had believed protecting them required accepting the story he had inherited. Now he finally understood that protecting them required something entirely different. He faced Cedric once more. "I will honor the covenant," Adrian said calmly, "but I will not honor a lie." A quiet murmur spread through the gathered crowd. Cedric's smile disappeared for the first time. "Your Majesty, do not allow uncertainty to cloud centuries of wisdom." Evelyn stepped forward just enough for her voice to carry across the terrace without becoming confrontational. "Wisdom invites questions. Fear demands silence." Lady Miriam carefully opened the oldest journal for everyone nearest to see. She read aloud the forgotten words of the first queen, preserving every sentence exactly as it had survived. The covenant was never created to claim a king. It existed to renew the promise between a willing ruler and the people he freely chose to serve. As those words echoed beneath the full moon, something extraordinary happened. The glowing symbols across Adrian's hand spread gently upward before rearranging themselves into graceful silver lines that resembled branches reaching toward the night sky. There was no pain on his face. No sign of struggle. Only quiet wonder. The moonlight surrounding the terrace seemed to brighten, bathing the ancient stones in a soft radiance unlike anything preserved in the rewritten histories. Adrian slowly placed his hand over his heart. "I choose my people," he said clearly. "Not because I fear losing my crown, but because serving them has always been my greatest honor." The silver symbols shimmered brilliantly before gradually fading into his skin like morning mist disappearing beneath sunlight. They did not leave scars. They left only a small crescent-shaped mark near his wrist, delicate enough to resemble a blessing rather than a burden. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. The covenant had not consumed their king. It had accepted his choice. Cedric stared in stunned disbelief, his carefully rehearsed certainty unraveling with every passing second. Evelyn looked toward Adrian, and for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Castle, she saw genuine peace replace the quiet exhaustion that had shadowed his every step. The kingdom had gathered expecting to witness an ending. Instead, beneath the light of the full moon, they had witnessed the beginning of a truth that had waited 400 years to be remembered. Morning arrived beneath a sky brighter than anyone in Blackthorn Kingdom had expected. The full moon had disappeared beyond the western mountains, yet its quiet promise seemed to linger in the crisp autumn air. For the first time in centuries, the castle bells rang not in mourning, but in celebration. The servants who had prepared black banners through the previous week carefully folded them away, replacing them with the royal colors that fluttered proudly from every tower. Across the courtyard, families embraced one another with grateful smiles, still struggling to believe the impossible had truly happened. The ancient story that had shaped generations had not ended with the fall of a king. It had ended with the return of the truth. Inside the great hall, every member of the royal council gathered once more beneath the stained glass windows that cast rivers of colored light across the polished stone floor. The forgotten journals, the recovered parchments, and the original covenant rested upon the council table where every noble could finally read them without alteration. Lady Miriam carefully began organizing a new royal archive, determined that no future generation would inherit another rewritten history. Lord Cedric stood quietly among the council, his confidence replaced by thoughtful silence. When Adrian addressed the gathering, his voice carried neither anger nor triumph. History was not healed by blaming those who inherited mistakes, he said. It is healed when we choose truth over fear. His words settled gently throughout the chamber, and one by one, the council members nodded in agreement. They unanimously approved the restoration of the original covenant into every royal record, ensuring that every future ruler would understand the promise exactly as it had first been written. Later that afternoon, Adrian walked through the castle gardens where golden leaves drifted slowly from the ancient oak trees. Evelyn stood near the reflecting pool, watching the gentle ripples spread across the clear water. She had arrived at Blackthorn Castle believing she was only another forgotten healer with little to offer beyond careful observation and quiet determination. Now she realized that sometimes the greatest discoveries belonged to the people willing to ask the questions everyone else had stopped asking. Adrian joined her beside the water. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt peaceful rather than uncertain. Finally, Adrian smiled. You did not save me because you were stronger than everyone who came before you. Evelyn looked at him curiously. Then why? Because you never accepted that hope had already failed. He looked down at the small silver crescent that remained near his wrist, the final reminder of a covenant that had become a blessing instead of a burden. Every healer tried to defeat what they feared. You chose to understand it first. Evelyn laughed softly. Sometimes the smallest question opens the largest door. Adrian nodded. And sometimes the quietest voice changes an entire kingdom. As the afternoon sun settled across Blackthorn Castle, children played freely through the gardens where silence and worry had ruled only days before. Merchants reopened their shops. Musicians returned to the village square. Hope, once treated as dangerous, became the kingdom's greatest tradition. Years later, storytellers would remember that extraordinary full moon for many reasons. Some would speak of the king who refused to surrender to despair. Others would tell of the forgotten covenant that restored an ancient promise. But the story most often repeated around warm hearths on quiet autumn evenings would always begin with an ordinary Omega healer who arrived carrying nothing more than a weathered satchel, an open mind, and the courage to ask a single question no one else had ever dared to ask, proving that true strength is not found in the loudest voice or the greatest power, but in the unwavering belief that compassion and truth can illuminate even the oldest shadows, and beneath that brighter future, King. Adrian Blackwood and Evelyn Carter walked forward together, not bound by fear or prophecy, but united by trust, hope, and the quiet certainty that the strongest kingdoms are built by those who choose kindness before certainty and truth before tradition.